The crowd had gathered in silence. Children clutched their parents' hands. Veterans, with medals pinned to their jackets, stood at attention, their eyes locked on a single figure. A lone tomb guard stood motionless at his post. His uniform was perfect, every crease sharp, his rifle gleaming under the late afternoon sun. To the untrained eye, he looked like a statue unmoving, unbreakable. But beneath that stillness burned a storm. And then out of nowhere came the challenge. A man pushed forward through the gathering, his voice loud, mocking, dripping with arrogance. You call this honor? Standing still like a mannequin. What's the USC of a soldier who doesn't fight? Gasps rippled through the crowd. A group of children shrank back. An old veteran clenched his fist, muttering under his breath. Reporters raised their cameras instantly, lenses trained on the unfolding scene. The guard did not flinch. His eyes, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, remained fixed forward. His jaw stayed tight. Not a muscle moved, but the air was heavy, thick with tension. Everyone knew something was about to happen. The mocking man drew closer, circling the guard like a predator taunting prey. You think you're strong because you don't move. You think this silly march and costume means you're a real soldier. The crowd shifted uneasily. One boy whispered to his mother, "Why doesn't he say anything?" And that was the moment where the world began to understand. Because the truth was simple. This was not weakness. This was not fear. This was discipline, a discipline most could never comprehend. The guard's silence was not an absence of courage. It was the very definition of it. Every second felt like an eternity. The mocking man sneered, expecting anger, expecting violence, expecting the guard to break, but the tomb guard remained as steady as stone. And in that silence, something extraordinary happened. The crowd who moments earlier were skeptical, confused, even entertained, suddenly felt the weight of his sacrifice. The honor, the code, the years of pain and discipline that had forged this soldier into an unmovable symbol. The veteran who had muttered, now straightened his spine, his eyes shining. The children fell quiet, their fear replaced with awe. Even the reporters, hands trembling on their cameras, began to realize they were witnessing a moment that would not just be news. It would be history. The crowd thought he would step aside, that he would finally defend himself, that his silence would be shattered by rage. But what happened next would shock the world. The world only saw a man standing still, but behind that stillness was a story most would never know. He had not always been a tomb guard. Once, he was a young soldier with a crooked smile and a heart full of fire. He had laughed with his friends in dusty barracks, shared cigarettes under a star-filled desert sky, and dreamed of the day he would come home whole. But war has a way of stealing more than blood. It steals laughter, hope, and sometimes even brothers. His closest friend had been taken in a roadside blast. A flash, a scream, silence. That moment was carved into his memory like a scar that never healed. Every step he had taken since then was heavy with the weight of a promise he had whispered while clutching his friend's blood-stained dog tags. "I'll carry your honor forward, even if it breaks me." When he returned, the noise of civilian life felt deafening. The world moved fast, careless, oblivious to the sacrifices buried beneath the soil. He found himself drawn to a place where silence was not empty, but sacred. Arlington, a field of endless white markers, each one a story cut short, each one a reminder of why men like him stood watch. Becoming a tomb guard was not just a duty, it was his redemption, his way of standing where his friend could not. And so he trained, for months, then years, training that broke lesser men, hours spent marching until his legs felt like iron, inspections so severe that even a single speck of dust could mean disgrace, nights where the wind cut through him like knives. Yet he remained unshaken. He bled for this discipline, not because he wanted recognition, but because he needed to prove to himself, to his fallen brother, that some things were worth guarding forever. Yet discipline is always tested, and on that day the test took human form. The man who mocked him was no ordinary heckler. He was a powerful figure, a politician with wealth and influence dripping from his tailored suit. His name had been splashed across newspapers, not for honor, but for scandal. Backroom deals, whispered corruption, arrogance, disguised as leadership, a man who thrived on belittling others to inflate his fragile ego. He did not come to Arlington to pay respect. He came to display his dominance, to sneer at a tradition he did not understand. To him, stillness was weakness. Silence was submission. He wanted a reaction, because to shatter the discipline of a tomb guard would be to prove that honor itself was fragile. The setting made his taunts all the more vile. Arlington was not just stone and grass, it was a cathedral without walls. Every headstone was a prayer. every name etched in marble, a reminder that freedom was never free. The air there was thick with sacrifice. Even the birds seemed to soften their wings when they passed over. It was a place where men whispered, not because they had to, but because reverence demanded it. To mock a guard here was to mock every soldier who had ever fallen. The veterans in the crowd felt it deeply. Their eyes darkened with fury, their lips pressed thin with restraint. They had fought too long, buried too many brothers, to stomach such disrespect. The families visiting graves held their breath, as though speaking might shatter the fragile dignity that still hung in the air. And yet, the guard stood as he had always stood. His life, his pain, his memories of war, all folded neatly into the tight lines of his uniform and the stillness of his body. Every insult hurled at him was absorbed like rain on stone. What the crowd did not know was that he had faced worse. He had faced fire, bullets, explosions, nights where fear clawed at his chest until he thought his heart would tear itself apart. He had stood over the body of his brother in arms, trembling, broken, wishing he could trade places. Compared to that, words were nothing. The politician's arrogance was nothing. But the test was not only his. The crowd, too, was being tested. Could they understand? Could they see past the silence and into the soul of what it meant to guard honor? Some fidgeted, restless, waiting for action. Others began to realize that they were standing in the presence of something far greater than a man. It was the living embodiment of discipline. The sun sank lower in the sky, throwing long shadows across the headstones. The mocking voice carried louder now, echoing off marble, filling the sacred air with poison. Cameras clicked. Phones recorded. The world beyond Arlington would soon see what was happening, and somewhere, deep inside the guard's chest, a memory stirred. His friend's last words, his oath of honor, the silent promise he had carried into every step since returning from war. He remembered them all, and he held them tighter than the rifle in his hand. He would not break, not for insults, not for arrogance, not even for the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. For in his stillness lay the voice of every fallen soldier, and no politician, no matter how loud, could silence that. The man's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Each word was sharp, meant to wound, meant to provoke. He leaned closer to the guard, his breath hot with contempt. Look at you, a puppet in a uniform. They call this service. You're nothing but a statue, a man too weak to speak. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some gasped, others whispered. Veterans clenched their jaws, their hands curling into fists. Parents pulled their children closer, shielding their eyes from the ugliness unfolding before them. But the reporters, they leaned in eagerly, cameras rolling, hungry for scandal. They knew this footage would spread like wildfire, an insult hurled at one of the most sacred traditions in the nation. The guard did not move. His hands remained locked on his rifle, his gaze fixed forward, his body unshaken. He was a pillar carved from stone, and no amount of venom could topple him. But the antagonist was not finished. He circled the guard slowly, like a predator toying with prey. His polished shoes crunched against the gravel, each step deliberate, taunting. He smirked at the silence, mistaking it for weakness. You think this makes you strong, standing still while the world laughs at you? You think anyone respects this charade? A veteran's voice rang out from the crowd. Show some respect. The man's face was lined with age, his jacket heavy with medals earned in battles the heckler would never know. His voice shook with restrained rage. That soldier has more honor in his silence than you'll ever have in your entire life. But the antagonist only laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that grated against the solemn air. He pointed at the guard, raising his voice even louder so that every camera caught his words. Honor, this isn't honor, this is submission. This is obedience without thought. And you, he jabbed his finger dangerously close to the guard's chest. You are nothing. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some shouted for him to stop. Others gasped, shocked that he dared cross such a line. Children clutched their parents tighter. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Still, the guard remained motionless. His face was a mask of discipline, his body unwavering. Inside, though, memories stirred. He remembered the sound of gunfire, the chaos of battle, the moment his brother in arms had fallen. He remembered the oath he had taken over a pair of blood-stained dog tags. That oath lived in his silence now. To break would mean betraying every sacrifice, every grave that surrounded him. The politician grew bolder. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a coin, and tossed it at the guard's boot. The sharp clang echoed across the sacred ground. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some cried out in outrage. One child whispered, "Why is he being so mean?" The coin rolled to a stop against the guard's polished shoe. He did not move, not an inch. The antagonist sneered. You can't even pick it up, can you? Too afraid to break your little act. That's all you are, an act. A costume. A fraud. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the crowd was fixed on the guard. Would he move? Would he finally break? The reporters zoomed in, their cameras trembling in anticipation. But the guard's stillness was louder than any word. The antagonist, frustrated by the lack of reaction, took another step closer. His voice dripped with mockery. What are you guarding, anyway? A box of bones? A tomb no one cares about? That was the line. The veterans in the crowd roared in fury. One man shouted, "That tomb belongs to heroes." Another cried, "You don't deserve to stand here." The air shook with anger, but none dared cross the rope. This was not their battle to fight. It was the guards. The mocking man leaned in, his lips curling into a cruel smile. He wanted to see the guard break. He needed it, because if he could shatter this man, he could prove to the world that discipline was a lie, that honor was fragile. But the tomb guard did not move. He did not blink. He did not breathe faster. His silence grew heavier, pressing down on the crowd, suffocating the arrogance of the man who mocked him. For the first time, the antagonist faltered. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. His smirk wavered. The cameras caught it, the crowd saw it, and for a brief moment, the silence belonged not to the guard, but to him. The man quickly masked his hesitation with anger. He shoved his hand forward, brushing against the guard's sleeve. The crowd gasped as if struck themselves. To touch a tomb guard was unthinkable, a desecration of the sacred. Veterans shouted, parents shielded children's eyes. The air turned electric, every heartbeat waiting for what would come next. The guard remained immovable. His hand never shifted on his rifle. His gaze never broke. He was stone, steel, silence. And in that silence, the crowd began to feel something profound. Children who had once whispered in fear now looked on in awe. Their small hands loosened from their parents' grip. They saw, with eyes unclouded by arrogance, the strength it took to remain calm in the face of insult. Veterans wiped at their eyes, the memory of their own battles flooding back. They saw in the guard the reflection of every fallen brother, every sacrifice made in silence, every act of courage that went unspoken. Even the reporters, who had come chasing scandal, felt the shift. Their lenses caught not a man breaking but a man embodying the very idea of discipline. And deep inside, they knew this footage would not humiliate the guard. It would immortalize him. The antagonist's voice cracked as he shouted again, louder, more desperate. Say something. Move. Prove you're alive. But the guard's silence was unyielding. It was louder than rage, sharper than insult, heavier than the arrogance pressing against him. And in that silence, the crowd began to turn. Where once there had been doubt, there was now respect. Where there had been confusion, there was now understanding. They saw that the man before them was not just standing still. He was carrying centuries of honor on his shoulders. He was guarding not just a tomb, but the very soul of sacrifice. The antagonist, red with frustration, clenched his fists. His arrogance had carried him this far, but even he could feel it a shift. The weight of silence pressing against his chest. He had mocked. He had taunted. He had thrown coins and words like weapons. Yet nothing had moved the guard. Nothing had broken him, and that truth, more than any insult, began to unravel the man who had come to humiliate. The crowd held its breath. The next move would decide everything. The air was thick with tension. The mocking man's face was flushed with frustration, a vein throbbing in his temple. His words had failed to break the guard. His taunts had failed. His attempts to provoke a reaction, ridiculous gestures, coins thrown at polished boots, an endless mockery had fallen flat against an immovable stone. Frustration turned to fury. He stepped closer, too close. The crowd leaned back instinctively, sensing the escalation. Veterans whispered under their breath, warning, pleading. Children hid behind parents, eyes wide with fear and awe. Reporters' cameras were locked on, capturing every movement, every flicker of emotion. You think your silence can save you? The man spat. His hand shot out and brushed sharply against the guard's sleeve, pushing him lightly, testing the limits. The crowd gasped. To touch a tomb guard was sacrilege. The veteran's jaws tightened. One woman's hand flew to her mouth in shock. The world seemed to hold its breath. The guard did not flinch. His body did not sway. His eyes did not shift. Not a single muscle betrayed him. He absorbed the shove like the wind absorbs a leaf present. Acknowledged, yet unmoved. And then it happened. The man reached again, this time more aggressively, shoving the guard squarely in the chest. The crowd gasped in unison, a collective intake of shock and horror. A child whimpered, hiding behind a parent. Veterans gritted their teeth, some muttering, "He has gone too far." Reporters' hands shook on their cameras, unsure what would happen next. For a fraction of a second, the guard's eyes flickered not with anger, not with fear, but with the weight of every memory he had carried. The dusty barracks, the roar of gunfire, the cries of fallen brothers, the blood-stained dog tags of a friend he had sworn to honor. Every step, every scar, every silent moment of training surged within him, coalescing into a single, controlled force. Then, without a sound, without a word, the guard moved. It was not a reaction of rage, nor one of violence. It was precise.com/controlled. He stepped just enough to regain perfect posture, and his hand, steady as a mountain, adjusted the rifle at his side. His eyes, cold and unwavering, locked onto the antagonist. The crowd felt it immediately, a shift, a wave of electricity that ran through every spine present. The mocking man's smug grin faltered, his arrogance cracking under the weight of the guard's gaze. Something primal and undeniable radiated from that still, disciplined stance, authority without aggression, power without chaos. Then man's voice wavered. What are you going to do?" The guard did not answer. Silence had already spoken louder than any words could. He did not shout, he did not threaten, he did not strike. Yet in that instant, the room seemed to shrink around the man's arrogance. The power dynamic had flipped, quietly but irrevocably. Every person in the crowd felt it. The veterans nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding at a visceral level what had just happened. Children stared, eyes wide, trying to comprehend how someone could radiate strength without lifting a hand. The reporters' cameras were shaking in their grips, knowing this footage would define the story forever. The antagonist, realizing the public humiliation he was about to endure, made a desperate lunging attempt to force the guard into conflict. But the guard's movement, subtle and controlled, blocked every advance. It was as if he had anticipated every possible action, every possible insult, and was ready for all of them without lifting his voice. A hush fell over the crowd, absolute and heavy. Even the wind seemed to pause, brushing gently against the headstones of Arlington, as if the earth itself was witnessing the moment. The man's face turned red with a mix of fury and panic. Sweat beaded along his forehead. He realized too late that he had underestimated the weight of true discipline. The guard's next motion was slow, deliberate. He lifted his rifle slightly, adjusting it with perfection, every movement precise, every breath measured. It was a signal not of attack, but of absolute control. The mocking man froze. He understood now that he had entered a space where arrogance could not survive. The crowd leaned forward, captivated, gasping with every tiny gesture. Some whispered prayers, some muttered names of fallen soldiers. The tension was unbearable, but the guard remained unshaken, immovable as a monument to honor. In that moment, the world outside Arlington could not see the subtleties of posture and discipline, but here, in the presence of witnesses, it was undeniable. The antagonist, once bold and arrogant, began to shrink under the weight of every story, every sacrifice, every silent vow that this man represented. And then, the guard's eyes narrowed not in anger, but in quiet, undeniable command, the kind that demands respect, the kind that strips pretense bare, the kind that makes chaos stop. The mocking man realized he had lost, not because someone struck him, not because someone yelled louder, but because he had stepped into a world he could never understand, a world where silence carried more power than any weapon, and discipline outweighed arrogance. And as the wind whispered through the white stones of Arlington, the crowd finally exhaled, trembling, stunned, and utterly transformed. They had witnessed the turning point, not a fight, not a victory of fists, but a victory of principle. A revelation that honor, patience, and unbroken discipline could humble even the most arrogant of men. The antagonist, desperate and humiliated, stumbled backward, muttering threats under his breath. The guard's gaze never left him, unwavering, unyielding. Every step the man took backward was another step toward the consequence he could not escape. Silence had become a weapon, and the crowd understood it. The children whispered, "He's a hero." Veterans murmured prayers under their breath. Reporters could hardly speak into their microphones, because what they had just witnessed transcended words. And in that quiet, heavy Arlington air, the guard stood still, calm, disciplined, and the antagonist stumbled backward, his arrogance shattered, his confidence crumbling like dry stone. He had pushed, provoked, and mocked, believing that words and gestures could bend a man forged by years of discipline, but he had misjudged the weight of honor. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in awe. Veterans muttered prayers, some eyes glistening with unshed tears. Children whispered to one another, "He's a hero." Phones and cameras clicked furiously, capturing every detail, every silent movement, every unyielding stare. The world beyond Arlington would soon witness this moment, but here, in the thick of it, it felt timeless. The antagonist tried to speak, to regain some shred of authority, but his voice faltered. Words that were meant to wound fell flat, swallowed by the gravity of the guard's presence. Reporters jostled to frame him in their cameras, capturing the moment he realized he had been completely undone, not by force, not by retaliation, but by stillness, patience, an unbreakable discipline. Then came the whisper of consequence. Security personnel, called by veterans and staff who had witnessed the aggression, moved forward. The man's attempts to resist only highlighted his vulnerability. Every gesture of defiance seemed smaller, almost pathetic against the unwavering resolve of the tomb guard. He was powerful, yes, but only in arrogance. In the presence of true honor, he was exposed for exactly what he was, a man who mistook noise for strength. The guard, meanwhile, did not move from his post, not an inch, not a glance away. He had no need for applause, no need for revenge, no need for acknowledgement beyond the silent affirmation of duty. His eyes scanned the horizon, unwavering, as if the world itself depended on his immovability. A hush fell over the crowd as the antagonist was gently but firmly escorted away. Some muttered under their breath, realizing the spectacle of humiliation had been absolute. Others simply stared, trying to process the gravity of what they had witnessed. It was more than a confrontation, it was a lesson carved into the memory of every onlooker. And then, as if the moment itself had drawn a breath, the guard resumed his eternal watch. He adjusted his rifle with the same precision as always, feet perfectly planted, posture flawless. The air around him seemed to settle, the tension dissolving into a quiet reverence. Children peeked out from behind their parents, witnessing not the fall of an antagonist, but the unwavering strength of the man who had faced him. One veteran, standing at the edge of the crowd, whispered to his companion, voice breaking, "I've seen many things in my life, but never discipline like this." Others nodded silently, heads bowed slightly in acknowledgement of the silent hero. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a heartbeat, sensing that this was a moment beyond capture. It was something to feel, to honor, to remember. In the days that followed, videos of the confrontation went viral. Social media erupted with commentary, hashtags trending worldwide. Headlines praised the tomb guard's composure, his discipline, his unshakable strength. Analysts dissected the footage, marveling at the perfect balance of restraint and authority. And yet, the guard himself remained untouched by fame. He did not seek it. He never had. His reward was in the act itself, the fulfillment of duty, the living proof that honor could not be bought, mocked, or broken. Somewhere among the crowd, a child's voice rose, soft but clear. "He's a hero." That single word echoed across Arlington, across time, carrying the weight of generations who had stood and fallen in service of a greater cause. The guard's eyes, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, flickered just slightly at the acknowledgement, but his expression remained serene. Unyielding, the world may have watched the humiliation of the arrogant, but the lesson endured far beyond that moment. Discipline had triumphed, stillness had conquered chaos, and in the quiet aftermath, Arlington itself seemed to nod. The headstones standing taller, as if paying tribute to a soldier who had defended not just a tomb, but the very essence of honor. And when the crowd finally dispersed, they carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed, a man unmoved by provocation, unbroken by arrogance, unshaken by fear, a man who had taught the world that sometimes the greatest act of strength is to do nothing at all. The crowd had slowly dispersed, leaving behind the quiet sanctity of Arlington. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the white stones, bathing the grounds in a golden, reverent light. For the guard, the world outside the line of duty ceased to exist. He remained at his post, rifle steady, posture impeccable. Even now, the adrenaline from the confrontation lingered in his chest, but his face betrayed nothing. A colonel approached, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. He was a tall man, decorated with ribbons and medals earned in wars and campaigns that had shaped a nation. He stopped a respectful distance away, eyes fixed on the guard with a mixture of admiration and pride. Without a word, the colonel raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute that the guard responded with perfect precision, returning the gesture that carried more weight than any words ever could. In that single motion, honor was recognized, respect was sealed, and the silent communication between two warriors spoke louder than any public accolade ever could. Nearby, a child tugged at a parent's sleeve, looking up with wide eyes. "Mum, he's a hero," the small voice whispered, almost afraid to break the sacred quiet. The parent simply nodded, pressing a hand to the child's shoulder, eyes glistening. The words hung in the air, fragile and profound, echoing the truth that the guard's actions had already imparted. Courage is not always loud, and heroism is not always seen. The guard's thoughts drifted inward. He touched the dog tags that hung from his neck, fingers brushing over the worn metal that had once belonged to his fallen friend. Memories of battles fought, promises made, and sacrifices endured came rushing back in a flood of emotion. He thought of the countless hours of training, the nights spent in bitter cold, the pain and fatigue that had forged him into someone capable of this moment. All of it had led to this, a silent stand, witnessed by thousands, yet felt by millions. A folded note was handed to him by a staff officer. He opened it carefully, reading the words written in hurried, precise handwriting. Your courage inspired more than you know. Thank you for standing when others could not. He tucked the note into his breast pocket, alongside his medals. A quiet reminder that sometimes acknowledgement is private, personal, and far more meaningful than public praise. As the day waned, a gentle wind rustled through the rows of headstones. He glanced across the grounds, eyes scanning the names etched in stone, each one a story, a life, a sacrifice that could never be replaced. Standing there, he felt connected to each of them, every memory and every vow flowing through him like a river of honor. He was not alone, he never had been. The oath he carried belonged not just to him, but to all who had come before, and to all who would follow. He adjusted his uniform one final time, straightened his back, and took a deep breath. The world beyond Arlington might have been loud, chaotic, and full of distractions, but here, in the sacred silence of duty, everything that mattered was crystal clear. Tradition was not weakness. Discipline was not rigidity. Stillness was strength. And as the last visitors faded into the distance, the guard resumed his eternal vigil. His eyes forward, hands steady on the rifle, every movement precise. He stood not for recognition, not for fame, not for reward, but because it was right, because it was his duty, because it was the silent legacy of every soldier who had ever given everything for a cause greater than themselves. The world might never fully understand, and that was perfectly fine. Arlington, the fallen, and the silent witness of history, understood perfectly. In that quiet moment, he was not just a tomb guard. He was the living embodiment of honor, courage, and unwavering discipline. And that truth would endure. Long after the crowd had gone, long after the day had ended, long after the world had shifted and changed, because some acts are timeless asterisk in a world that moves too fast. It is easy to mistake motion for courage, noise for strength, and words for honor. But the story of the tomb guard reminds us that true power often lies in silence. In stillness, there is purpose. In discipline, there is courage. And in quiet vigilance, there is a legacy that cannot be shaken, mocked, or bought. We watched as arrogance collided with unwavering principle, and what unfolded was not a battle of fists, but a testament to the strength of character. The guard did not strike, did not shout, did not retaliate, and yet his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Every child who witnessed him learned what heroism truly means. Every veteran who saw him stood taller, reminded of sacrifices both seen and unseen. Every observer, every camera, every recording carried forward a lesson that could not be erased. Respect, honor, and discipline are timeless, and perhaps the most important lesson is this: the world will always test you. It will push, provoke, and challenge you to respond in ways that are loud and dramatic. But sometimes, the greatest victory comes not from fighting, but from holding your ground, steady and unwavering, against the chaos around you. So let this moment serve as a reminder that strength is not always visible, and courage does not always roar. It is often measured in the quiet decisions, the patient endurance, and the unshakable commitment to what is right. If this story inspired you, share it with others who could use a reminder that honor is worth standing for, even when the world seems to question it. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the courage, discipline, and integrity of everyday heroes. And remember, sometimes doing nothing is the bravest act of all, because it is in stillness that true strength shines.